Welcome to the debate.
Today we are diving into one of the most, I think, profound and complex historical questions of 20th century China, specifically the changing status and role of women during the Mao era, from the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 right up until Mao's death in 1976.
And the historical context here is, well, it's everything. We have to remember that before the revolution, Chinese women held an incredibly low status. They were governed by Confucian practices like the three obediences: subordination first to the father, then the husband, and finally the son. You had practices like foot binding that were widespread, and institutionalized concubinage basically treated women as property.
Right. And into this context, the Communist Party, under Mao Zedong, promised a radical reversal, a total change. And this was all captured in that iconic phrase, "Women hold up half the sky."
So, the central question for our debate is this. Did the policies and the ideological transformation of the Mao era truly deliver on that promise of liberation? Or did that powerful slogan ultimately mask a kind of continued oppression and structural inequality? I'm going to argue that Mao's era brought about necessary and truly transformative legal and ideological changes that at their core fundamentally liberated women from traditional subjugation. It provided them with legal rights and access to the public sphere that were, well, previously unimaginable.
The rhetoric was progressive. The revolution failed critically in its implementation. We see clear evidence of what's called a double burden and a consistent subordinating of women's genuine needs to the state's overriding economic goals. So in this light, the movement for women's liberation in China remains, in historical terms, a revolution postponed.
The transformation was, it was undeniably real. And its success lies in the thorough demolition of the old patriarchal structures. The core achievement really was the establishment of a robust, state-enforced legal framework. You have to start with the new marriage law of 1950. It stands as a truly revolutionary document. This wasn't just window dressing. It banned arranged marriages, it gave women the right to own property independently, and it made divorce readily available to both sexes. This instantly granted women a massive amount of personal autonomy and legal standing within the family unit for the very first time. Crucially, Mao correctly identified women as a vast reserve of labor power. Their mass mobilization into collective farming and the urban workforce delivered what was effectively liberation through labor. Women shifted from being cloistered wives to recognized, valued socialist workers. And that's an enormous psychological and social leap. The state actively created new opportunities, including military service in the PLA, which offered women technical education and leadership skills. We also see tremendous growth in education. The percentage of girls attending primary school went from 38% before the PRC to near 100% after 1959. The whole ideological creation of the Iron Woman provided a new, respected social identity rooted in achievement and public service.
That is certainly a compelling account of the legal transformation, but I think it focuses a little too much on the public spectacle and ignores the material conditions of daily life. While the legal framework provided the right to equality, the reforms effectively stopped right at the household doorstep. The party promoted women heroically laboring outside the home, but critically, it failed to provide the necessary structural support to relieve their burdens inside the home. The primary burden of domestic chores, cooking, mending clothes, and, most importantly, childcare, it still fell almost entirely to women, even after working a full day in the collective fields or in a factory. This created the exact double burden that historians have unanimously noted made women's lives intolerably difficult. Furthermore, the state's economic fixation on heavy industry just made this worse. Mao's vision meant that labor-saving appliances, common in other industrializing nations, washing machines, for example, were simply not produced or distributed. So Chinese women were performing complex physical jobs while simultaneously maintaining a domestic workload that was, frankly, artificially inflated by technological neglect. And finally, the sheer persistence of deeply entrenched traditional attitudes, particularly in rural areas like Xinjiang, it meant that male control over families often just overrode the new legal framework, keeping women effectively tied down as possessions. The law just couldn't penetrate the deeply guarded structure of the rural family.
You highlight the difficulty of the domestic burden, and that is a fair criticism. But we have to weigh that against the magnitude and the sheer scale of the social and economic access that was achieved. My point is that the volume of women who entered collective farming and the workplace was historically unprecedented. It represents the largest shift of labor in human history. Moreover, the state did provide institutional support intended to foster public participation. The mass organization known as the All China Women's Federation, or the ACWF, which eventually swelled to 76 million members, created genuine avenues for social and political progression. They organized literacy classes, skills training, and they taught women practical skills like how to operate a plow. This was genuine institutional scaffolding supporting women's entry into the public sphere, actively overturning thousands of years of tradition that had confined them to the home. This level of state investment in mobilizing women, well, it can't be dismissed simply as failed implementation. It shows a fundamental commitment to gender equality as an ideological goal.
I'm just not convinced that the scale of participation automatically translates into equality. While millions of women did enter the workforce, the evidence shows systemic, structural discrimination that really belies the notion of true economic parity. Let's look closely at collectivization. Studies demonstrate that while women contributed enormously to collective farming, they routinely earned fewer work points than men for the exact same amount of labor. And why? Because the most valued tasks, the ones involving large animals or machinery, which earn the highest work points, were culturally and systematically reserved for men. The party cadres, steeped in traditional bias, rationalized this. They argued women had a weaker constitution, so this wasn't a system based on pure socialist meritocracy. It was gender prejudice formalized within the collective economy. And the urban workplace mirrored this bias too. Women were often shunted to low-paying collective neighborhood workshops, which offered just meager pay, zero benefits, and dismal working conditions. Meanwhile, men were prioritized for employment in the more secure, more comfortable, and well-funded state enterprise jobs. If the ideology truly valued women holding up half the sky, why did the economic structure continuously pay them less and offer them inferior opportunities?
But surely that systemic discrimination, while it was clearly present, is a residual effect of deeply ingrained cultural bias. The lingering presence of old thinking, not a failure of the progressive framework itself. The law provided the right to equal pay and equal work. The presence of the ACWF provided the platform for collective organization and political challenge against those local prejudices. If the framework provides the capacity for women to mobilize and fight for their rights, doesn't that represent a profound shift in power dynamics? Before the revolution, there was no recourse against those biases. Now, there was a legal mandate and an organization of 76 million to back it up.
The problem is that the state framework failed spectacularly right at the point where it was needed most to alleviate the structural causes of inequality, which was the domestic burden. The state's promise to ease women's workload through communal services, especially during the mass collectivization of the Great Leap Forward, that political campaign from 1958 to 62, it failed disastrously. The communal kindergartens and mess halls, which were meant to free women from the double burden, they just collapsed. They were poorly staffed, overwhelmed, and during the horrific famine that resulted from the GLF, they became death traps. Historical accounts confirm high death rates as starving adults, often cadres themselves, stole the meager food intended for the children. This collapse forced starving villagers, predominantly the women, to return to the unsustainable duties of childcare, cooking, and fieldwork. Then what's more, historians like Frank Dickiter have documented overwhelming evidence of systemic abuse during this period. As families disintegrated under the pressure of starvation, sexual abuse and rape spread like a contagion through the communes. Many desperate women were even forced into prostitution simply to trade sex for food. This level of regression, where women were forced back into the most basic forms of sexual subservience just to survive, is a devastating indictment of the state's failure to protect them. It suggests their interests were entirely subservient to political and economic experimentation.
That's a horrific and an undeniable picture of the human cost of the famine and the political failure of the Great Leap Forward. I agree that the famine led to brutal regressions. However, I would argue that those failures reflect a systemic political catastrophe, not a failure of the initial feminist ideological goal itself. The goal was to establish women as political and economic equals. And in many respects, their capacity for collective political action and resistance grew and actually survived that crisis. I mean, if we look at the Cultural Revolution that followed, for instance, women played the exact same political and sometimes violent roles as men as members of the Red Guards. They mobilized, they led campaigns, and they achieved positions of ideological power previously closed to them. This demonstrates a deep-seated ideological acceptance of equality in the public sphere, an ability to mobilize and participate that was an enormous step forward from their purely subservient role prior to 1949. The tools of ideological equality were resilient, even if the state structure that provided childcare services was fragile.
This brings us to the core issue of authentic identity. You speak of resilience, but the official propaganda was so successful, it arguably deprived women of the private language necessary to articulate their personal experiences of ongoing struggle. Anthropologists conducting field studies, people like Marjorie Wolf in the 1970s, they found something fascinating. Chinese women were remarkably effusive about the miracle of female emancipation, even in the very presence of their continued oppression. The sociologist Naihua Zhang noted that it became so easy to accept the widely promoted ideal of gender equality that it just masked the reality. The state's ideological campaign successfully shaped self-perception to the point where, as observed by the historian Elizabeth Kroll, all publicly acceptable narratives rigidly followed the standard script. The woman's rise from mistreated wife to independent socialist worker.
This required women to subordinate their private misery, the exhaustion, the domestic injustice, the stagnant career advancement after marriage because of domestic responsibilities, in favor of the collective, acceptable narrative. If liberation means possessing the capacity to articulate one's true condition and demand structural redress, that personal voice was systematically suppressed by the official rhetoric of the Iron Woman.
That is a powerful philosophical critique of revolutionary rhetoric, but I think you might be underestimating the genuine psychological empowerment that the ideology provided. The campaign instilled a new self-perception in women, one that allowed them to see themselves as equals in outlook, in value, in achievement, giving them the courage to imagine a radically different life. Look at the perspective of the older generation who lived through this. The source material includes the testimony of a grandmother, a journalist, and a labor hero promoter, who stated that despite all the terrible things Mao did, the communists made women's lives much better. She was able to move from having a housewife mother who resented her husband for taking a concubine to pursuing a full career, becoming a political figure, and ensuring her daughter received a graduate education. This collective ideological identity rooted in the idea of socialist purpose. It superseded the misery of individual oppression, and it provided a powerful shared framework for futures that were previously just, well, unattainable. This capacity for vision, for political engagement, and for career advancement across generations, that is a profound form of liberation that changed the direction of Chinese society forever.
I agree that the narrative of upward mobility exists, but we have to ask, for whom? We've already established that upward mobility in urban areas was often stifled by marriage and family obligations, and in rural areas, male authority often ensured that women never fully realized the promise of equal pay or status. And if the women who achieved high political positions, like Jane Qing, often owed their access to power largely to their husbands, as was consistently the case at the national level, then the ideological framework failed to create truly independent female political power. The liberation was legal and ideological, yes, but until the structural elements, economic equity, relief from domestic burdens, and the freedom of authentic personal expression were met, the revolution for women was only partial. The party prioritized economic production over true gender equity, and that is why the oppression, albeit modernized, persisted.
Nevertheless, the core legacy of Mao's revolution for women was the establishment of that legislative foundation for gender equality. This bedrock provided undeniable legal protection against practices like concubinage and arranged marriage.
And critically, it unlocked mass opportunities in education and the economy. It fundamentally challenged the foundational structures of the traditional patriarchal system. And perhaps most importantly, it gave women the essential capacity to envision and articulate greater futures for themselves. This public and legal transformation was profound and irreversible, even if the implementation did lag.
We must conclude, however, that despite the groundbreaking legislative rhetoric, the party failed to translate legal ideals into effective structural support or cultural reality. The resulting double burden, compounded by systemic economic discrimination and work point allocation, the catastrophic collapse of communal services during the famine years, leading to desperation and abuse, and the ideological suppression of authentic personal narratives, all of this demonstrates that women's emancipation was consistently compromised in favor of state economic goals. Their liberation was incomplete, and the status of women in Mao's China remains best understood as a promise only partially fulfilled, a revolution profoundly postponed.